There are a number of ways for a car maker to become one of the greats.
Wicked.
It can make good, solid cars. Or it can sweep all beside it on the racetracks. But it must have an indefinable something if it wants to win a place here on the bedroom wall. You see, the patrons of these automotive galleries aren't concerned by things that adults worry about, like fuel economy or running costs, or, dare I say it, build quality. When I were a lad, my bedroom wall played host to the Ferrari Daytona, the Lamborghini Miura, and, rather embarrassingly, the Volvo 1800 ES. But for today's children, it's all a lot more clear-cut. There's only one king, TVR, a company that is celebrating its 50th birthday. In 1947, Enzo Ferrari was starting out in Maranello, but so was Trevor Wilkinson, a motor engineer from Blackpool. He built himself a little sports car which, after he dropped the vowels from his Christian name, became the TVR. However, before he could use it, he sold it.
So he built another, this one in fact, the oldest surviving TVR. It's got a Ford side valve engine, Ford wheels and a Morris back axle, but the front suspension is all TVR. Like so many specials of its time, it's a real bitzer. The rev counter is from a Spitfire, aeroplane, not car. And the fire extinguisher comes from a Royal Staff car. Only the best for our Trevor. Trevor wasn't the only car maker to cut his teeth on a special like this. Lotus and race car builders Lola started with similar machines. Like this TVR, they're pretty basic, with no creature comforts, but it was good for 80 miles an hour in its day. Those first cars were made of aluminium, but in the 1950s the company began its adventures with glass fibre, and very pretty they were too. This model is an open sports of the mid-50s being driven by Trevor himself. If you wanted one, you bought the parts and rolled up your sleeves. Trevor Wilkinson's right-hand man in those early years was Jack Pickard.
The first ones were in kit form, because you didn't have to pay any purchase tax then. So they were built, the bodies were done and the chassis were assembled and that. And you fitted the wheels afterwards, and the engine and the electrics, but everything else was fitted.
It was an exciting time for the Blackpool boys.
We were creating something from nothing virtually, and to see it now after 50 years, well worth the fag and hard work.
The first TVR to sell in hundreds rather than in ones or twos was launched in 1958. It was called the Grand Tourer.
It's a derivative of the term Grand Tourer, and if you run that through a computer spell checker, it comes out as Grunter, and now everybody knows my car as the Grunter.
Believe it or not, the Grand Tourer body started life as two bonnets from a long-forgotten company called Microplast. One for the front and a chopped-off one for the rear. With some slight modification, it set the body style for all TVRs to come. Fiberglass bodies were mated to solid backbone chassis with various parts borrowed from other cars. It was a recipe that kept TVR cooking for years. The windscreen, originally from a Ford Consul, was still being used 20 years later for the 3000M. The Grand Tourer is pure 60s to drive. A torquey engine, burbling exhaust, a big steering wheel.
And I feel I should be in a James Bond film or something, and the car should be filled with millions of gadgets.
All yours in 1962 for £860, with an MGA engine and a little bit of elbow grease. TVR was on its way.
And if the Grand Tourer set the style for the look of TVRs, their next car set the style for performance. Nowadays, TVRs have a reputation for being real muscle cars with plenty of brute horsepower under the bonnet. And it was in 1962 that an American motor trader decided that the weedy 100 horsepower MGB engine simply wasn't up to the job. So he stuck a massive 4.7-litre Ford V8 in his Grand Tourer. His name was Jack Griffith. TVR were so impressed with Jack's efforts that they put the Griffith into production. Apart from the big power bulge on the bonnet, it's hard to see the difference.
Let's hit the throttle. And you can certainly feel the difference.
Oops!
I think a blancmange springs to mind.
You could have two choices of engine tune. The basic motor came as a cooking 195 horsepower version, but spend a little money on the valves and the cams, and you had a whopping 285 horsepower, which is what this machine has got, and it weighs just 3/4 of a ton.
And it's got skinny little tires on the back.
An American motorcycle racer was quoted as saying he felt safer flat out on the Daytona banking on his bike than sitting in his Griffith in the garage. Griffith's dream was to do to the TVR Grand Tourer what Shelby had done to the AC Ace. Initially, demand doubled production in Blackpool, but poor reliability and a dock strike in the States would, in part, lead to the end of Griffith's production.
TVR then had orders and problems. Build quality was poor, orders weren't met, and Wilkinson had been eased out by a management that changed almost every week. Help, however, was at hand.
I got involved with some people down in London who were involved with TVR dealers. And I got to know a chap who had some shares in the old Grand Tourer engineering company. And he was getting married, and he needed some money. So I actually bought the shares off him. And 2 weeks later, the company went into liquidation, voluntary liquidation. So I had a long talk with Father, and we decided, you know, to see if we can buy the assets of this company and get into car manufacturing. Well, I was 23, you know, when we took over the company. It's probably the fact that I was quite innocent, really, of what could happen in business and manufacturing, whereby, not knowing the pitfalls, we just careered ahead and just damn well did it. It was pure enthusiasm, more than anything else, just to prove other people wrong.
Now, Italian car makers could always name cars after themselves, Ferrari, Lamborghini, Alfa Romeo, but you can't call a car the Martin. So Mr. Lilly's new model became known simply as the M. Some of the TVR hallmarks that we know and love today were starting to shine through. It was pretty, loud, and like punk, it flew in the face of the establishment. They used to sell them in places like Rotherham at a time when even the picket lines were on strike. They were cheap and cheerful, and if they went wrong, you just hit the offending part with a hammer until it started to work again. I used to work as a trainee reporter on the Rotherham Advertiser, and every day I'd go past the town centre TVR dealership and I'd dream, like I used to dream of owning a Saturday Night Fever suit.
We finding it very hard to get the TVR name known. And we came up with the idea, you know, of using girls on the cars with not much clothes on in order to get the publicity. I don't forget, I was going into London on tube train to the show, and everybody on the tube there was sitting in the mirrors and what have you, Daily Mirror's Sun or whatever, I can't remember the papers, but there it was, TVRs all over the place. I mean, that was publicity, it worked, it got the name known.
I tell you what also got the car noticed. On this model, the Ford V6 motor was turbocharged. Now, this was the first ever British turbocharged production car. They said that it was as accelerative as a Porsche 911, but... well, it's quite quick, but it's not 911 fast, that's for sure. In many ways, it's kind of quite like a Triumph TR6. You've got this cramped driving position, a small, compact body, a wooden dashboard, and then leather. Well, when I say leather, this was the 70s. This was the most successful TVR of them all. But as the 70s gave way to the 80s, it was a time of great change. Jim Callaghan, for instance, became Margaret Thatcher. But that was a tiny little shuffle compared to the triple jump they were doing in Blackpool.
TVR commissioned former Lotus stylist Oliver Winterbottom to design a new car, unlike anything that had gone before. The result, launched in 1980, was a car with pin-sharp edges, a million miles away from the round and chunky shapes of old TVRs. It was christened Tasmin, a combination of Maserati's Casmin and a girlfriend of Martin Lilly's called Tamsin. The logic was simple. A car that would bring TVR up to date and provide an entry into foreign markets that were being abandoned by the likes of Triumph and MG. How could it fail? But fail it did. It didn't take off in the United States, and perhaps with hindsight, it was about half a decade too late, as aerodynamics were already softening the shape of other cars. Whatever the reason, like its looks, the car's effect on the company was dramatic. It may have stormed to 130 miles an hour thanks to Ford's Cologne V6, but sales plummeted. Production all but halved, eventually forcing Martin Lilly to sell the company. In order to sell cars to the Middle East, where in some places Ford was a dirty word, TVR fitted Rover V8s to the Tasmin. Throughout the 80s, the car developed into ever wilder versions until they got to this, the 450 SE. I've got the power!
I've actually got a bit of a problem with the styling. It's the wedge shape. I actually prefer the curved, round shapes they're producing now. But as soon as you get in it and you drive it, it doesn't matter what it looked like.
He's right, you know. Once you wriggle into the hot seat, fire up the V8 and hear that fabulous rumble and snarl, the last thing you're bothered about are its looks or build quality. People, they get a hot and sexy 4.5-litre V8, which is just awesome. If you can track one down, you won't stop grinning.
The wedge, however, had emptied Martin Lilly's pockets of wedge. And now a customer who'd popped to the factory for an oil change bought the company.
It was a total accident. I went through all the British sports cars, and the last one I arrived at was a TVR. And I thought it was great. I gradually became involved with the factory because I used to have it serviced at the factory. I had just about enough money to have a modest retirement when I got sucked into TVR. Everybody thought I was raving mad. The people who knew me, my lawyer and my accountant, they all thought I'd flipped, you know, and they were probably right.
As the wedge-shaped TVRs became ever wilder and more upmarket, Peter Wheeler introduced a new entry-level model, the S, in 1986. The new shape harked back to the TVRs of the 50s, 60s and 70s, and it soon became clear that curves were the way to go, as the new model doubled TVR production, and led to the introduction of the new Tuscan at the 1988 Motor Show, complete with a 420 horsepower, 4.5-litre Rover V8. The Tuscan was intended for use both on the road and in the new one-make racing series. While road car production never happened, the racing series took off in spectacular style. As I found out for myself at Croft last year.
Hang him out to dry. Oh, this is not going to work. It bloody nearly works. And for the amateur driver, there is probably no better value for money racing than these TVR Tuscans. For just £26,500, you've got a 450 horsepower rear-wheel drive racing beast. This is the Tuscan that I raced last year, and it's got the optional power steering fitted, which I really enjoy. I find it lovely to balance the car in little power slides. And they're not slow either, because lap times are very similar to the very expensive, super high-tech British Touring Car Championship contenders.
The Tuscan Racing Series is a big part of the package that has turned the TVR image into something very special. It also led to the creation of a model that was very special, the new Griffith. It was launched in 1989, and by the time I tested it in 1993, it had a 5-litre V8 producing 340 horsepower and 350 pounds-foot of torque. The power takes the Griffith from 0 to 60 in 4.5 seconds, to 100 in just over 11, and to a top speed of 157 miles an hour. But it's not really the increase in power that's noticeable on the 500, but the increase in the torque, that mysterious factor that describes the ability of an engine to pull strongly through its rev range. The grunt and guts to climb hills. This TVR feels like it could accelerate up a vertical cliff. The handling and general ride quality are really very good indeed, while the steering has a lovely feel, but it is very heavy when it comes to parking. The clutch and gear change are also rather on the heavy side. This is not a car for wimps. More than any other, the Griffith was the car that put TVR in the big time.
Then, disaster. BMW bought Rover, who was supplying the V8s, and after declaring, "I'm not having anything German in my cars," Wheeler set about making his own 4.2-litre V8 for the amazing new Cerberus Coupe. It has a flat-plane crank like a Formula One car and churns out 350 brake horsepower, which makes this the fastest accelerating car I've ever driven. They say it's the first TVR for 10 years to suit the family man, but only if you've defied science and managed to give birth to a couple of hamsters. Those back seats are pretty tiny. And anyway, let's be honest, family cars do not ever sound like this. I don't have any figures to hand, but I can tell you this. I am driving the noisiest, most exciting and fastest car this side of a Lamborghini Diablo. If this car could sing, it would be like the gas fitter with his gravel in his tonsils. Joe Cocker. This car is completely and adorably unconventional. It's the same story on the inside. I love the way they've grouped these instruments above and below the steering wheel. I love the buttons on the steering wheel. I love the swoopiness of this dash. It's like something out of the 50s, the 2050s. A time when you don't start a car with anything so dull or tedious as a key. Engine start. And it's not just the big bits that TVR started making themselves. They no longer rely, for instance, on old Humbers for switches and knobs. And this means, of course, that making a TVR these days is a pretty complicated recipe. Over now to Fanny Butler Henderson, one thin lady.
Take 47 yards of mild steel tubing. Measure, cut, and weld. Then roll 52 square yards of chopped strand glass fibre, cut and paste with gallons of resin and lashings of gel coat. Set into the desired mould and then leave to bake. Gather 7 leather hides. Cut and sew for a tight fit. Add 1 square foot of veneer for the dash. Then it's time to take the body from the mould and mount to the chassis, before decorating with 4 gallons of paint. Mix a few hundred components for a meaty V8, before slipping it in and adding the final garnish.
Now, Blair's Britain is a caring, sharing place, and yet more and more of us are buying Blitzkrieg TVRs. So, Mr. Wheeler, what's your secret?
I think it's a very British car. And that, I think, it's quite understated, fairly cheap to buy, and it's got a little bit extra underneath. We basically try and add up how much they cost and put on a very small margin for ourselves and say that's what it is. We tend to make a reasonable return on what we do, and it saves bothering having to have marketing men to try and bullshit the public into paying more for them. So it's a very simple process. These 1.8 litre heavy 2-seater so-called sports cars aren't sports cars at all. They are 2-seater convertibles as far as I'm concerned. Nearly all those, the MX-5s and the BMWs and whatever, have the same format. So it's warming people up for buying a proper one. You know. All cars have niggles. I'm not aware that ours are any worse than anybody else's. I don't accept that our competitors are any more reliable than ours. I don't accept it at all. It's slightly unfortunate the first guy's name was Trevor. It would have been better if he'd been called Ferrari or something like that. But I think it's now about made its mark, and I think as long as somebody doesn't do anything silly, and I don't do anything silly, I think it's here to stay.
I've been racing TVRs for 6-7 years, and what attracted me to the Cerbera was the design of the car. It's very similar to the race car in a lot of respects. It has an integral roll cage, which makes it extremely safe. The brakes are massive, 13-inch in diameter, so the size of Escort wheels. Tremendous performance, and it does really give you a buzz every time you you drive it down the road.
I thought about a colour that was a really beautiful colour, and I thought about it for a long time, and then I suddenly thought the colour that was most beautiful was the colour of my ski boot. So I took it up to the factory and they matched it for me. I've had 3 TVRs, and the first one I had, I fairly soon after I had it, I took it to Silverstone to learn how to cope with a skid. And soon after that, I had an opportunity to go around Castle Combe, and then I realised what the car was actually all about.
I think all TVRs through the ages, but particularly this one, really is such a wonderfully, truly British feel for a sports car. It's could be akin to a very sophisticated big Healy, I think. You know, it makes a noise which still brings out the little boy in me.
So where next? Well, TVR has taken off its gloves now and is going after the big boys with a car that next year will race at Le Mans. It's called the Speed 12, and I don't think I've ever seen anything quite so brutal. There'll be a 5-car range next year, another new model, and another new straight 6 engine. Trevor, eh? The boy done good. What I've got here is a list of all the British car companies that have gone to the wall in the last 50 years, and it's appalling. There's Alvis, Allard, Armstrong Siddeley, Argyll, Austin Healey, and they're just the ones beginning with A. And yet TVR, by gorging itself on a diet of spinach and anabolic steroids, just keeps getting stronger. Sure, they break down a lot, but there will always be a place in our hearts and on the roads and in our children's bedroom walls for a car that makes this much noise.